Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, a psychotherapist helping men through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Leon McFadden, a former police officer who has transformed his relationship with trauma and strength. Leon writes at trauma2strength.substack.com, a Substack newsletter, where he shares his journey and insights on redefining what true strength means for men and humans. Through his personal experience and professional background in law enforcement, Leon offers a unique perspective on how men can move from surviving trauma to finding genuine strength and healing. Leon, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Very excited to chat. So, your work challenges the common stereotype that equates emotional stoicism with strength while viewing vulnerability as weakness. From your experience, both personally and from your police days, can you speak to how this misconception actually undermines true strength and what real strength looks like for men?
Yeah, well, it was doubly hard for me because obviously, as a man, we're discouraged from showing vulnerability in society. But two, being a police officer, our job is to take control of difficult or traumatic situations, and there's no room for crying or getting upset because people look to you as being the strong person, the person that's going to take control of a situation. When I went to traumatic incidents, I didn't have the ability to process the trauma at that time. I had to compartmentalize it and only show any weakness when I was on my own in private, and then I had to put the uniform on again, get back out there and do the same thing again the next day, the next day, the next day. And trauma piled on top of trauma. And I never had the luxury of being able to process it. My first traumatic experience only occurred maybe 4 or 5 months after I joined the police. I'd been very sheltered as a child, so I didn't have any understanding of how bad reality could be. It was early hours of the morning. We were called. The call taker told us that it sounded like there'd been a loud bang, and it sounded like two girls had fallen out of the sky. But I didn't hear that properly on the radio, and I said to the sergeant who was in the car with me, "What did they say again?" And he said, "Oh, it sounds like two girls have been assaulted." So this was on a Saturday night, and I thought, well, these sorts of assaults, they happen all the time. Maybe we'll get there, we'll find two girls with like nosebleeds. Maybe I'll have to arrest one of them. Kind of tedious. They're probably drunk. When I got there, I saw two ambulances, so straight away I knew this wasn't the run-of-the-mill Saturday night fight. And then I saw two girls laying on the floor. So I got out of the car, and as I approached the scene, one of the paramedics said to me, "One's dead and one is dying." So that took me by surprise because now I'm thinking, well, what's happened? Have they been murdered? And it took a while to piece together. But what they've done is they've gone to the top floor of the tower block, and in a suicide pact, they've both jumped from the top floor. And my job was the one that was still alive but barely. She was taken away in an ambulance but died fairly quickly. And my job was to guard the body of the other one that was already dead for over 3 hours. And there was other police there, but other police had different jobs where they would be inside the tower block knocking on doors and trying to get evidence and stuff. So it was just me guarding this body for 3 hours. And it turned out I knew the girl that was dead because I used to work in a shop, and she lived across the road from the shop and would sometimes come in. So it wasn't like she was my friend, but there was enough identifying with her and enough hours standing there doing nothing but guarding her. I took in all of her injuries. I took in the tragedy of what had happened. She'd left a note on her mobile phone for the family. And when I got back to the police station, I had to suck it up. I was near the end of the shift anyway, but I had to fill out a accident report for a car accident that had happened earlier that night, and then I had to go home. So as I left the police station, I started to cry, much to my disgust, because I still thought at that time policemen shouldn't cry. An early morning jogger jogged past, and I remember sucking it back up and not crying again because I thought I don't want anyone else to see me break down. By the time I got into my car, I then cried all the way home. I then got home, got into bed, cried while I was in bed, cried when I got up, and to some extent I cried most days for the next 20 years. And then after that, I went back to work after my days off, and a couple of months later, went to another tragedy, then another one. And the trauma pile on top of trauma made it even harder to treat. And eventually, it took a few years, but eventually I broke under the strain and was medically retired. And I was told at that point that I was 100% disabled for the rest of my life, that I'd never get better, and that I was now going to be incapable of doing almost anything. About a year or two after that, I then was diagnosed with schizophrenia as well, and that's what made it so hard to recover, because I now had multiple illnesses and multiple traumas.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I know that's obviously a traumatic story, not only to experience, but, I imagine when you recount it, memories and visualizations and triggers come to mind, though it seems like you've healed a lot through that. Now, I'm curious, when you first started to cry, where do you think that voice came from? Let's call it the voice of suppression that like told you it needs to be shut down or I need to really stow it away. Do you feel like that was innate? Do you think that you heard it like in a particular voice, meaning maybe your father or your buddies or yeah, just curious if you have any insight there of what you feel
Well,
like the
when I
source
was at
was.
school, I was badly bullied, and I was taught from like the age of like 11 to 16 that showing any sort of vulnerability or weakness would get me verbally or physically abused um, at school. So I went into the police in an effort to show that I was tough, because I'd recovered from the bullying, taken up karate and boxing. I wanted to show not just the world, I wanted to show myself that I could handle tough situations. But I'd already been taught that weakness would be punished. And joining the police was at that time, probably still is, but I don't know. But at that time, it was a macho sort of environment where um, you were only one of the boys if you were strong, acted a certain way. Um, and there was, as I say, there's no room for weakness, because there's nothing worse than if a police officer turns up at a scene to try and help and then they break down. That was the biggest fear I had. That to me seemed unforgivable. And at the time, it seemed kind of pathetic that a policeman would, show vulnerability like that. So it was the bullying and the the stereotypes of police officers coming together that taught me you have to either not show weakness or be careful who you show weakness around.
Right. And it's a tough situation to be in because, as you're saying, it forces you to say, if you're going to be accepted, if you're going to be credible in doing your job, then you have to sacrifice the weakness, the vulnerability, the showing emotion. You can't have both because really it's okay. You either sacrifice your humanity and you play a role that you get things done or you're functional in that way, but it really on a deep level is causing a dysfunction on a human level, which is what you're getting out of compounding effect to the point where you were eventually diagnosed as disabled. I mean, fully taking away your functionality by in a interesting manner having to sacrifice it all those years.
Yeah, and it got to the stage where we'd go to someone that had been dead for a long time, so the smell would be atrocious, and there'd be a newer officer there with us, and he'd start being sick, and we'd laugh at him, but we'd laugh at him whilst trying our best not to be sick ourselves, but we'd pretend that we weren't feeling sick. We'd pretend that this is just normal. Oh, this guy is being sick. We'd make fun of him, and then we'd go home, and I'd certainly feel the effects of, I saw some of these people in my dreams and stuff for months or years afterwards. So who got the last laugh, sort of thing? The guy that's obviously admitting that he's struggling with a situation, or us that are just suppressing, putting on this.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's one exactly. It's an act, and it's the only act that is acceptable among men. And I'm curious when you felt like you started to realize what true strength was as a man. What was that moment like? How would you describe it? And
Well, the final straw came when I had to guard um, uh, a woman and a baby had escaped from a violent relationship, and the man had tracked her down, and he had murdered her with a hammer, and he had strangled their baby, and he had then killed himself. And I had to guard the back of their house next to the window where her bedroom was, where she was murdered, for 13 hours, again overnight, and again on my own because their other officers were guarding the scene, but they were guarding around the front. I had to guard the back because it's not uncommon for journalists to try and get pictures of the scene by going round the back and trying to look through the window. So I had to guard that scene for 13 hours. And after that, a couple of days later, I now got to the point where I was crying before even going to work. And I went to the sergeant and I said to him that I can't do it anymore. And I tried to tell him about the first incident where the two girls had jumped out of the building, because that was always my worst one. And I just started to cry because I couldn't used to talk. I didn't used to talk about it like this. It took years for me to be able to talk about these situations. So I started to cry, and I'm standing in this car park, and I've got tears rolling down my face, and I'm thinking, this is supposed to be, my idea of what's strong so far clearly hasn't worked because I'm now in this situation. I'm clearly not strong. I've been pretending for years and it just doesn't work. And the first time I had ever had any therapy, I just spent the whole time distracting her from what was really going to help me, because I didn't want to go to the places that hurt the most. So my act finally fell apart, and I then sank into a very deep, long lasting depression. And only by trying to survive that did I have to rethink my beliefs about strength, because I felt like I was going to end up killing myself. So I needed to figure out a new way for me to relate to the world. My old idea of being strong obviously wasn't it, because it had led me nearly to the end.
Yeah, it reminds me of a typical process in a male rite of passage is a core wounding. And the point of purposely wounding the boy is not to let him be overwhelmed or think that he is disempowered, but almost to help him come in touch with the wound as a part of humanity, as a part of the world's suffering, as a part of realizing life is as bad as you think it is, and as we all learn, and it sounds like in your case, worse. And our ability not to dismiss it, but to sit with it, engage with it, and learn how to work with it and out of it. I mean, that's the healing work. And it's really a key sign of maturity. I mean, up until that point, you're stagnating the maturity, you're plateauing your progress because suffering is real, trauma is real, and by ignoring it or suppressing it, it delays your ability to move forward. And I'm curious, you talk about the significant cost of toughing it out when it comes to long-term trauma. Can you share what that looked like in your own life specifically, and what you've observed in other men who have taken this tough it out approach?
Yeah, so because I had post traumatic stress disorder ever since the first incident, I spent years having full on flashbacks where I would break down and think that situations that had happened to me in the past were still happening to me now. I'd lose track of where I was in like time and space, and I would feel like I was in imminent danger. And these flashbacks could last like half an hour, 45 minutes. And during those times, one of my family would have to just sit me down, hold my hand, reassure me to try and get me to come back to reality, kind of like a waking nightmare. And they were sporadic for the best part of 20 years. I would avoid things that reminded me of each trauma as best I could. But the thing is that I desperately wanted to stay as a police officer. So I still had to police the same areas that had caused me the trauma. And I still potentially could have gone to other people that were going to kill themselves in a similar way. And I knew for those years that I was still in the job that I wouldn't be able to handle going to another suicide by jumping. And I thought to myself, if I do go to another suicide by jumping, I think I'll probably take that as a sign to kill myself. But luckily I didn't, although I went to several people that were about to jump, and I was the one that was on the top floor of each place with them, trying to talk them out of it. And thankfully for me and them, I managed to talk everybody else out of it, including one that I had to fight to stop getting to the edge of the car park. He was up there in the corner one night just before Christmas, of this year, not this year, but the year that it happened. And I went up there, and the wind was howling, and he was shouting something to me, but I couldn't hear him. And I said to him that I'm just there to help him. I don't want to do anything to him. And he came down towards me with his fists out. And I put my hands on his fists and said to him again, "I'm just here to help you. Let's talk about what's got you here." And at that point, he broke free and he ran towards the edge. And only by me jumping on top of him and wrestling him to the floor did I stop him going over the edge. And that was as much for my benefit as his, because I dodged a bullet that night as well.
In those moments where you're talking to someone whose potentially last moments on earth are shared with you, what do you say? I mean, is there any training on that? And in that moment, what was going through your mind? How are you feeling?
But the police are very ill-equipped to deal with those sort of situations. Um, we might get an hour or so at training school about how to talk to those sort of people in those sort of situations. But luckily for me, I used to be a Samaritan, which is an organisation in the UK that takes calls and visits from people that are in various levels of despair. But the main focus of the Samaritans is on people that are suicidal and about suicide prevention. So we spent weeks training for that role, learning how to actively listen, show empathy, try and put yourself in another person's shoes. So I did have better training than some as to how to deal with these situations. That one, I didn't really have to do much talking because he wanted to fight and then he wanted to escape. But there was an 18-year-old boy that was on top of a car park on another occasion, and he had actually climbed over the edge and was hanging off the side with holding on with his hand, but one leg dangling over the edge. So the first thing that I did is I took my stab vest off because I didn't want him to think of me as a policeman. I wanted him to think of me as Leon. So I told him my name, took my stab vest off. I sat on the floor so that I didn't want to come across to him as any threat whatsoever. And I promised him that I wasn't going to bum rush him. I wasn't going to try and do anything sneaky. And I just wanted to try and understand why he was where he was. And he talked to me for about 30 to 45 minutes, and I managed to persuade him to come back over the edge. And we took him to a psychiatric hospital. I've got no idea what happened to him after that, but it was all about not trying to convey that I've got some sort of authority. I wanted to relate to him on a human level, not a level of police officer and person that we've been called to, sort of thing.
That's such a powerful story, and one that really, I believe, is a reflection on how we learn to engage in our own trauma. The trauma tends to have this, what I like to call hyper authority over us, because in the moment it takes us out and we're not equipped, we're not ready for it. And then we almost feel indebted to it, whether or not we want to be. And our ability not to see it as this armed threat, but as a deep, deep, vulnerable wound that has happened to us that's now a part of our story, whether or not we like to. And it's in the dialogue that we actually find the healing, and in the engagement, and in the, even you sitting on the floor, it's lowering yourself to its level and equaling it out instead of this hierarchy of separation. So that story just strikes me as such a beautiful symbol of, it seems like, how you've approached your trauma. And on that note, traditional therapy wasn't effective for you in your healing journey, which ironically, it's not an awkward moment for me as a therapist to say that's quite common. So what alternative paths to healing did you discover, and how might these resonate with men who've had similar experiences with conventional therapeutic approaches?
So first of all, I got lucky because medication really, really helped me. I know it gets a bad rap a lot of the time, but it took me a lot of trial and error to find the combination of meds that would work. And they all came with horrible side effects. The antipsychotics, especially, one of them made me gain 85 pounds of weight in a year, which was olanzapine, which is well known for weight gain. And at that time as well, I was heavily into going to the gym, doing martial arts. So it was just another cruel blow to have all this weight gain on top of something that I'm trying to do to alleviate depression. So I came off of olanzapine and was put on a different antipsychotic, and yet the different one worked. But I was then put on another medication that gave me complete insomnia, so I couldn't sleep at all. Then I was put on another one that had me sleeping 15 hours a day, so the complete opposite. So it doesn't sound good, but eventually they found the right combination. And the catch with mental health medication is the right medication for me might be terrible for somebody else, and the thing that works for them might be terrible for me. So it's not even like I can say, oh, if you take this, this, and this, it will really help. But at least explore the avenue of medication, I would say, because especially for schizophrenia diagnosis, there's not much else. It is medication that controls the illness basically. So medication brought me to a level where then I could focus on some lifestyle changes that I could do to keep me improving. Also, I was no longer suffering delusions, no longer hearing voices. And at that point, I decided that I needed to find a purpose because I still thought that I really loved having been in the police. I still got pangs of sadness when I saw a police car, and I needed another purpose in life. So I just started to write on a website called Medium actually, and I would write like self-help articles and stuff. Not very good, not really with any sort of focus in mind, but just as something to do to stop me just sitting in my room for 24 hours a day doing nothing. And at that point, I realised that hey, this is quite interesting. This is something that I'd like to improve at. And what I'd really like to do is help others with trauma. But how do I get to a stage where I can write about traumatic things? I can't even bring myself to say them. So I worked out there was an author called Jeff Thompson, and Jeff Thompson was very bullied and abused when he was younger, and he went on a similar quest to try and become tough. He took up martial arts and he devoted his life to trying to understand the concept of fear. And he devised a system of a fear pyramid. So the fear pyramid is you put at the bottom of the pyramid something that you're scared of, but not too bad. You can probably handle it. And you build up on the pyramid to the top, which has got your worst fears. So I thought, well, I'll do something similar. I'll make like a ladder. And at the bottom of the ladder, I'll put being able to mention the trauma for the first time. The second part of the ladder then was I would write about the trauma, but not to anybody else other than to myself. The third part of the ladder then, well, maybe I'll write about the trauma, but I'll send it to other people. The fourth part would be I'll say the victims' names out loud. The fifth part would be talking about the trauma to loved ones that were safe. And then the next part could be I'll be able to write about it and I'll talk about it on podcasts or whatever. And gradually build up to the point where I would visit the scene again without any problem. Just keep doing it and doing it until it lost power over me. And by the end, I was able to talk about it, go anywhere, do anything. I'm not held back by locations or memories or anything, which in a way is toughing it out, I suppose. You just keep on drilling away until it stops hurting. But it's a more constructive toughing it out than just ignoring it. This time you're going through the pain rather than doing anything to like act like it doesn't. You're not acting like it doesn't hurt. You're accepting that it hurts and you're going straight through it. And that's the thing that helped me the most.
So well said. I appreciate that reframe, that it's not that you lose the tenacity, the courage, the strength, but you reframe it and you channel it to not bypass the wound and the suffering, but as you say, to go through that. And I think that's such a powerful message because many men believe, well, if I admit, if I am vulnerable, if I tell other people, then that act in and of itself means I'm, let's say, losing power or respect or dignity. When in fact, you're actually maintaining the true integrity of that word in a way that is effective and helpful. And what I hear you saying is that the exposure therapy is staged, that you have to start with the most minimum, safest, secure exposure, writing it out, which is also just so powerful. Many people think, unless I have an idea, I shouldn't write. But it is so therapeutic and freeing to just write it out because you really don't get a sense of what you believe, where you're at with something until it's out of you and you're separate from it to a degree. Up until that point, it sounds like the trauma for you was so entrenched in who you are, you had no sense of what it was doing to you fully because there was no separation. As you started writing it out and then saying the names verbally, then talking about it, that each stage seemed to create that healthy separation so that it never was apart from you, but you had some distance from it within you so you could heal from it. Does that feel resonant?
I always felt like my traumatic experiences were like a thick knot inside my brain, and it was very hard to sort of know where to start, because if you start trying to address one part of it, then another part will start flaring up, and it's hard to know what to do. So by doing it in gradual planned stages, starting with very small acknowledgements of the trauma and building up to the top of the pyramid, it's just gradually untangling the knots, and you have to do it slowly. If anybody heard this and thought, oh, I'll just go to the top of the pyramid and just do it all at once, you could cause yourself a lot of damage. And ideally, if you had someone that you could trust who was like a professional, you would do it with them. Ideally, you wouldn't do it alone. In my case, I had no choice. Been trying professionals for 20 years and disliked almost all of them. So I had to do it on my own because there was nothing left by that point. And also, I could never accept this 100% disabled for the rest of my life diagnosis. I mean, what does that mean? Does that mean like you're just going to sit in a corner for the next 50 years and not move? 100% disabled seems, I don't know, it didn't sit right with me.
Well, this is the catch to a diagnosis is they're helpful in as far as they put language to helping you understand your experiences, especially with the schizophrenia. Okay, the voices in the head, these things like we have a name for it and then we have a treatment that's associated with it. Where it doesn't help and where we've done terribly is we've created a codependency on the diagnosis. And I don't know how it is in the UK, but at least in the US, a big part of that is because of healthcare insurance, right? So it's like big pharma, health insurance, in cahoots with each other, capitalism, all the things. And it moves from, okay, this is a helpful framework to help me understand where treatment's at, to this is who someone is. And we do not see any form of treatment as valid outside of medication. And it's a very linear process. And the issue is someone may say, it seems like this was you. Okay, now I know I have this diagnosis. And then the given treatments that were very limited in scope, it's like, it's not actually helpful. And then it's kind of like people say, well, too bad. Sorry, like try to figure it out, right? You're just stuck with this. It's something I like to say is it becomes a life sentence instead of a sentence in life. So instead of it just being a part of your journey that you can framework and put experience to, it becomes an imprisonment and defines your whole life. I'm curious if you felt that was true for you.
Yeah, I try now not to say things when I write like anything that identifies a person as a disorder. So things like schizophrenic or my PTSD. I sometimes slip with my PTSD, but I try not to do anything that reduces a whole person to a diagnosis or a cluster of symptoms. Just because I think that if you start thinking I'm a schizophrenic, you've now taken away everything else that you are, and you've taken one part of you and blown it up to be you, but you're a lot more than a schizophrenic. You know, if you meet two people with schizophrenia, they're not the same. You're identifying with a group that doesn't exist, and that sort of mindset holds you back because you're an individual who has schizophrenia, but you also have many other good and bad traits. So little tweaks in language help as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that too, because that goes for trauma. When people go through it, especially men, they think, well, if I share this, people will think this is who I am. And I'm curious, you went through a period of time where you were ready to start sharing it with loved ones. And a common scenario I find in my therapy work is men who know that they have trauma, but are scared even to tell their partner, the person that they love the most, or other loved ones. So I'm wondering if you have any tips or insights in how a guy may start to safely and securely, in a normalized manner, share with those loved ones around him and your benefits of doing that?
I mean, I would say that to start off with, I was lucky that I had two loved ones, my mum and my partner, that I knew I could trust 100%. So once I could overcome my revulsion at the brutality of the incidents, once I could bring myself to stay in that space thinking about those incidents without too much panic, I knew that if I could just start to talk to them about what had happened, and they knew the basics anyway, but obviously I didn't go into detail for quite a long time. But I knew that I'd be safe in doing so because I knew that I could trust them 100%. Um, so if you're in that fortunate position, it obviously makes things a lot easier. But if you do have to be careful who you tell, because someone could make it worse depending on how they respond to you. Like all society things, like someone said to me once, isn't post-traumatic stress disorder just overthinking? So if you get met with that kind of response, then and that's the first person that you've decided to have, you found the courage to tell, then that will just damage you, like, beyond measure. You have to be careful who you decide to start talking to at first. You have to be lucky in a way that you have to know someone that you can trust. Therapists would then obviously come in if you didn't have anybody you can trust. And I know a lot of people do have good experiences with therapies. Although I haven't had good experiences, I do always say on my Substack and everything that therapy should be at least something that you should try, because I know a lot of people that have had good experiences. And, just because I haven't doesn't mean that you will be the same. But you have to find someone that you can trust one way or another to begin that process.
Yeah, I think that's right. Thanks for the endorsement, by the way. I agree with you. I think, the ability to sense that safety also is very muddled at the beginning when you're processing the trauma, because you're just starting to learn to be safe with yourself. You've been unsafe for so many years. Those first few shares are so critical because they really can model how you see healing and opening up. And I'm wondering, you mentioned your partner and your mother. It's beautiful that you have those two people. Also noting they're not men, so I'm curious what your experience was like then once you felt safe enough to tell some of your buddies, your guy friends, any other male figures in your life. That's another level I find is unfortunately not normal, but should be, is, if you have a group of guy friends, and obviously within reason, without trauma dumping, it should be normal to start sharing your burdens and sufferings and what you've gone through. So I'm wondering what that experience was like, bonding with another man over sharing your trauma.
So I had my dad. He was a more complex situation. It was a more complex situation with him because he died in 2019, so I talk past tense. But I had no doubt ever that he loved me. Whether or not he loved me was not the issue. The issue was that he would often open his mouth and say the most the worst things that you could say in the situation, either out of frustration or not knowing the right way to word things. So he would try and be supportive, but he got angry at situations. Like, he got angry and frustrated that I was suffering post-traumatic stress disorder, and he wanted me not to be suffering. So he one day said, I don't give an F about those two girls that died, because I was totally absorbed with these two girls that died. He started to get angry and almost blamed them for causing his son pain. So he come out with that. That triggered my first ever flashback. So I never felt that he was safe to confide in because of moments like that. And the first time ever that I left the house quickly because I wanted to go and confront the scene of that incident. And I knew that if I didn't get there quick and confront it, I'd probably chicken out and not do it. So I left and I went to confront the scene, came back. He was angry that I had risked that. So it was never a safe. He was never a safe person to talk to, because you'd have to worry about, will he say the wrong thing? Will he trigger a flashback? Will he put his anger above what he should be saying to me? So in the end, I just didn't confide in him because it wasn't a safe thing to do. As the years went on, we actually managed to communicate better. And before he died, at one point, he actually apologised to me for getting it wrong so many times. And I also apologised to him because there were times that I would take things that he said, not those things, they were obviously bad, but I would sometimes take things he said the wrong way because I was expecting a confrontation with him rather than giving him the benefit of the doubt. So we made amends for a lot of our disagreements in the past before he died, and that I was glad about that. But he wasn't someone that I could really trust to talk to. And as far as my friends went, most of my friends, well, almost all my friends were other police officers. And the police seem to be great at, if someone was physically hurt on duty or struggling physically, they will visit you and they will try and help you. When it comes down to trauma, I had one colleague, one friend ever phone me up after I left, and gradually the phone calls faded away. And within about a year, I had no police phoning or contacting me or checking on me whatsoever. And when I left the police, it was a very adversarial thing because I was going to be medically retired, which would mean that they would have to pay me for the rest of my life for the injury that they caused. So they wanted to really put me through it to test that I was as I said I was. So they knew that I struggled to leave the house. So they sent me to 4 different doctors and psychiatrists all across London to force me out of the house and make the situation as hard for me as possible. Out of sheer spite, I made sure that I did go to all of those appointments. It was one of their own doctors that said I was 100% disabled for the rest of my life, which must have really annoyed them. And they even at one point were um, illegally sniffing around my medical records. One of the inspectors was trying to get my medical records, and I was actually phoned by, because I was in 2 different police forces. The first trauma happened in one police force, and then when I was medically retired, I was in a different police force. And the inspector from the last police force was trying to get my medical records from the first one, and I actually got phoned by the headquarters of the first police force to warn me that there were senior ranking police trying to get hold of my personal records, and just to be aware that that was happening. So they wanted to prove that I was fine, and everyone that they sent me to kept confirming that I wasn't fine. So there was no friends, there was no supportive environment. It was adversarial from the start, and they never offered me any therapy. They told me to sort it out myself as well.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, I'm sorry to hear that. That is part of the reason, I think the traumas are perpetuated. There's, of course, broken systems and mindsets that cause them to begin with. But then afterwards, it's similar to, I'm sure it's similar in the UK, but after a lot of veterans come home from war in the US, there's just not a lot of support. There's not a lot of gratitude and thanks for what they've done. Now, everyone has different reasons for getting into law enforcement, military, all that. But nonetheless, there's a baseline respect that someone has offered to sacrifice their life and put themselves at risk. And we just let them deteriorate slowly when they're not convenient at protecting anymore. And it's changing here in the States. It's interesting, speaking of alternative modalities for therapy treatments. There's a lot of work being done with psychedelic assisted therapy. So I'm curious if you had any thoughts on that. But, we are doing more to help support veterans and people who were, in law enforcement. But I still think, unfortunately, your experience is not a rare one. And it's something that I'm really glad you're bringing a voice to it, because it's something we need to advocate for, in our society.
yeah. A lot of the homeless people in our big cities are former military personnel. So I think it's the same in both our countries, that they're just not integrated back into society. They're just forgotten about, basically. And as far as treatment goes, the only 2 treatments that I had, some of my treatments were paid for by the National Health Service, and some of the treatments I paid privately when I was feeling like particularly desperate and didn't want to wait for the free treatments. But the free treatments were always cognitive behavioural therapy, because it's usually quite quick and cheap. And a lot of therapists would promise to cure me within 6 weeks of having these treatments. And they'd give me a long list of other people that they've cured, such as a paramedic who had trauma for 20 years. They said they cured him in 6 weeks. And then when they didn't cure me in 6 weeks, they basically just like gave up, and they'd start each session by telling me I can just talk about what I want to talk about. And that was it. The other type of treatment that I had, which in the early stages worked reasonably well, was EMDR, which is in my case, it was looking at a blue light moving from left to right, and at the same time bringing to mind aspects of the trauma. When I had one trauma and I was juggling being at work and seeing a therapist once a week, that therapy helped me with the first trauma quite a lot. But the problem was the therapist and the doctors involved then said that I could stay at work as a police officer. Now I was cured of the trauma and I'd be fine. But what I found is I was now weakened to the point where when when I started to experience other traumas, the first trauma came back with a vengeance, and now I had multiple traumas. And then when I tried EMDR again, never worked properly again. So in my case, it worked okay for one trauma, but when things got more complicated, it stopped working.
I think it speaks to the complexity that everyone's situation is so unique, similar to the medication. But that also, again, another catch 22 to where the healthcare system wants to treat you in as far as you continue to rely on them. And the minute you don't need them anymore, they don't care. And it sounds like you were penalized for getting healthier, right? Because then from that point on, it's like, well, until you're at the point of suicidal ideation and hearing voices, we're not going to treat you. But as soon as you get at, right below baseline, you're done. Like, figure it out. Now you're good enough and move on. And it's this phrase I use, the convenience of care, which is we only really care about people when they benefit us. And I realize that everyone can't be 100% altruistic and generous. I don't think you expected that either, but I think we can do better about not just treating people when it's convenient for us.
Yeah, and
So, so
I saw the medical records after I'd been helped with the first trauma, and the police doctor said in the records that we should all pat ourselves on the back for how well they've cured me, and now I'm ready to go back. And within 3 months of going back, I found the young man that had hanged himself, and he'd been there for 2 weeks, and that just sent me spiraling into another trauma again. Looking back, I shouldn't have ever gone back to the police. I should have been thank my lucky stars that I was feeling better and gone. But no one told me not to go back to the police, and I loved being in the police at that time. So no one said, well, yeah, you've recovered, but maybe you should do something else. Maybe you're not mentally as strong as you were, even though you've made progress. Let's end it now while we're on a point.
yeah, you make a good point that we continue to push people uh, to the limit, and we're not really supportive of them realizing their thresholds. And like you said, the blessing that, hey, I've already reached this threshold. Why are we trying to gamble my life away again? But this is a very male mindset, I'd say, is ambition at the cost of healing, which is no, just keep going, overcome, press through, toughen up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, live into who you are. And that's really the dark side of my experience in the self improvement world, is like people just want to go, go, go and accomplish and expand and grow. And it's usually at the cost of their mental health and who they are. But there's this constant pressure from society where we find ourselves being, even if we stopped in place, we find ourselves being gently push from behind to keep going. And, our ability to name our limits, I think, is so important. And in that world, kind of, you had a lot of unresolved trauma throughout your police force days. I'm curious how that showed up in your daily life. If you could share some specific examples of how the trauma manifested in ways you maybe didn't initially recognize as trauma related. There's a lot of men out there that just struggle with drinking too much, right? Or just feel sad every day. And really, what it is these traumatic symptoms wreaking havoc on them. So, yeah, just curious if you can name some of those practical symptomology that you found in the unresolved trauma.
Yeah, so I worked shift patterns, so I wasn't off of work each weekend. But on the weekends that I was off of work, I'd go into London with one of my friends. He wasn't in the police, and I'd just get as drunk as possible for the whole weekend. I never considered myself an alcoholic because apart from those weekends, I didn't drink. But I was using alcohol to numb myself, and it was the only way that I stopped feeling such pain. So I was a kind of alcohol dependent. Looking back, but at the time I didn't know that I was. And that came to a head when I was in a club one night and I was yet again drunk. I'd been sick over myself, lovely, lovely stuff like that. And I suddenly saw everybody in the club without a head. So I was like hallucinating that everybody was dying and had been beheaded. And I said to my friend, I've got to get out of here because I'm seeing, everyone's dying. And managed to get outside calm down, and by the next morning when I sobered up, I thought this is, the wake up call now that alcohol isn't helping either. So we probably need to give that up. And I gave it up. So it wasn't too hard to give up once I realised that I was depending on it. But the other main thing that happened to me was I was angry all the time. Police work makes you very skeptical of people because people tell lies all the time. And even when it gets to the stage where you've got a victim and a suspect, that the suspect has been hitting the victim, but then in a week's time, that victim will be the one that's hitting the suspect. So the policing is like dysfunctional family. Seems like being the dad of a dysfunctional family, where you just turn up and put sticking plasters over these massive societal issues. And I just got jaded and angry. And when I would go, I'd get in regular arguments with my partner, and I never did anything to like provoke violence in the police, but I quite liked it when suspects would resist because I quite liked the release of getting into a fight with them. At worst, they'd beat me up, and I felt like I deserved that anyway. And at best, I'd be able to unleash some of my frustration. So I started to have the mentality of, one of my chief inspectors described it as a siege mentality, where in the UK it's like we make a big thing out of policing by consent. So the police are the public and the public are the police, and we try our best not to use force and to relate to the public with our words basically. And I was growing to hate the public and always expect the worst of them and stuff. And they said I had a siege mentality, and I was always arguing with my partner. And the most bizarre thing was that at that time, not try not to be too political, but at that time I became very right wing. And it's only now that over the last couple of years that anger has gone and I'm back to my old self, that I'm now left wing. And it was really very bizarre to me to see that change, because I never ever linked my right wing phase to anger. But now I look back, I can see that at that time, right wing people have got a lot of things they can point to blame, and they've got a lot of easy answers for things. So immigrants are bad, so now we've got a target there. So these things. Whereas left wingers are kind of, well, there's nuance here. Someone's not necessarily all good or all bad. Things are not all black and white. Yeah, so it was weird. It was weird. I've never seen any studies or anybody else to confirm why this is the case. But I was left wing before I became a police officer. I became right wing when I was in the police, and as the anger's gone, I've become left wing again. So that was also a thing that came up.
That is fascinating. And I appreciate you naming some of those signs that you experience that someone could point to. Yeah, I also haven't seen the studies. There's a good book Jonathan Haidt wrote, The Righteous Mind, that talks about the different values and concepts that each party, at least in the US, relates to. I think anger is a very common experience that a lot of men have. It's more or less the only emotion that most men can even name. And yeah, I think the right wing associates a lot with the respect for authority and defense and patriotism, all those things. But I think, anger from a psychotherapeutic lens is a defender emotion. So it's the one that shows what you care about. It's justice bent. So it says, this is what's wrong that needs to be made right. And there's a deep sense of protection and putting up a wall for anger. But I often say that anger, especially in men, is a protective emotion, but it's not a primary emotion, meaning it's usually the first one to manifest. Hey, that's wrong. Don't do that. This isn't right, whatever it is. And a lot of men are really good at that first one, right? Let me put up the wall. Let me take my stance. Let me put my foot down. The issue is that it's usually protecting the more vulnerable primary emotion because I'm sad, because I'm scared, because I feel anxious, whatever it is that's the turtle underneath the shell. And many men get the concept of defense right in general, but terrible in practice on the right hand side, which I'm sure you experienced. And that's because you need the left wing vulnerability, care, nuance to make sure that that's actually what you're protecting and something that you need to integrate into that. So I'm not a political expert, but that is my sense of maybe where you're coming from.
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. I've always felt like anger is the disguise for another emotion. It's if I could either cry, in which case people will look down on me, they'll think me weak, or if I'm angry, it means that I'm driven to be an achiever, or that I'm strong, or that I feel, or that I can disguise anger and say that I'm not angry. I've just got passion for something. So it's easier to be angry than it is to be sad. It's easier to be angry than it is to admit to feeling guilty. So anger is the acceptable mask for other negative emotions, but anger causes so many more problems.
Yes, exactly. Because it's often misexpressed. One of the worst things I think we've done in society is to tell men not to get angry. It's not that they don't need to get angry, it's that they need to learn how to more effectively get angry. Channel the anger to properly protect, defend, express. All those things are really important in society. Police force, military, borders, safety, all these things every human needs to some degree to feel safe. When that becomes the thing, we idolize it, and we also use it to either further perpetuate risk of safety for others or to keep people out. That's where it becomes really bad. So for any guys listening out there, anger is a powerful emotion. It's natural. It's God-given, and we're meant to express it, but you need to learn how to express it rightly, because as Leon is saying, that's the difference between a healthy man and an unhealthy man. And I'd like to end with this last question. You've just generously shared in such an honest and beautiful way a lot of your experiences with having severe trauma. And while many men do fall into that category, there's a lot of guys who may say, I've had bad things happen to me. The common term is little t trauma, right? But it didn't have those major effects. But nonetheless, my pitch is that every man needs healing to a degree, because you've had a wounding at some point. So I'm curious, for those guys that are starting to recognize they need healing, but are concerned with appearing weak, vulnerable, that they'll be ostracized, what are some practical first steps they can take to honor both that need for healing and their sense of masculine identity within that?
So start by being honest with yourself. You might have the big T trauma or the little t trauma, but that doesn't make the experience less or more valid. And if you can be honest with yourself to start with about where the trauma comes from, then you can start thinking about how can you address the trauma. And I think that's where the things like the fear pyramid come back in again. So you can address the trauma in small segments. But those small segments might be completely different to the segments that I used. Your segments could be related to relationship trauma or the loss of a job, or there's infinite small t and large T traumas. And it really helps to have someone that you can confide in to go through that journey as well, and to say to that person, you don't necessarily want that person to fix you, but you're not looking for actual advice, which I think as a society we fall into the trap of too much, where someone tells us a problem and we want to fix it, especially men. But instead, you want someone to sit in the darkness with you and share the pain with you. And that can then be a massive catalyst to helping you recover and heal as well. People aren't going to be able to solve your traumas. Because they can't solve it, it often means that people are wary of wanting to talk to you because they don't know what to say. But it's less about what you say and more about how you support someone by listening and trying to hear what they're telling you.
Wise, wise words. I couldn't agree more. Oftentimes people get caught up on trying to be ideal or perfect or sane or doing the right thing. But the lesson I'm taking and what you're sharing is the presence is the purpose. Someone's ability to show up, to be there. They're never going to be perfect in how they do that, but that person's not asking you to. And I just appreciate that framework analogy you said, sitting in the darkness, that it often starts with, all right, I just got to be real with myself. Where am I lying to myself, minimizing the truth, living in an illusion or fantasy, whether I'm meaning to or not? How can I actually come to terms with what has happened to me, the effects it's had on me, and then what would it look like in a safe and secure way to start sharing with others, and not just dump it and move on, but in a way that invites them into that journey in an appropriate manner that we walk together. I think there's something empowering as a man to know that part of how you show up is your capacity to support others, to be generous in your presence, being there for people. And it sounds like that's just a place that many men can start.
I mean, I just yesterday released the first part of like a 5-part thing that I'm doing on Substack about how to survive suicidal thoughts and stuff. And one of the things that I always say is that you don't have to have it all figured out and have all your problems solved to stop feeling suicidal. You just have to stay and start the process. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't need everything to be right now in order to stay. You just need, the beginnings of a plan. You shouldn't put too much pressure on yourself too soon because you're already uh, suffering, and we can be our own worst critics in the end with the way that we talk to ourselves. We say cruel things to ourselves that we'd never say to a best friend or to anybody else, but we can be our own worst enemies.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode on toxic shame and how many men self-flagellate with their words. I know I've done that as well with my own trauma. And Leon, just appreciate your time today and your wisdom, your insight, moreover, your story, your vulnerability. And you just mentioned Substack. Is that the main place people can find you? And if so, if you could just share the name again.
Yeah, Substack's been life changing for me, and it's the only place that I write regularly now. You can find me at Trauma to Strength at substack.com.
Great. Well, Leon, thank you again. And guys, we'll make sure to put that in the show notes along with the fear triangle, which was a helpful framework. So thank you again for your time, Leon. For you guys listening, the takeaway is be honest with yourself, find someone you can share with, but take your time. But do not delay in working your way step by step into the healing you deserve to eventually become the man that you're meant to be and that you are born to be, and not seeing trauma again as a life sentence, but a sentence in life that you can certainly address and stay present to for a while, but realize it's just a part of your story that informs who you are. So thank you again, Leon, for sharing your story.
Thanks for having me on.